Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, and welcome to this discussion, this conversation with Sharon Rosen, who is with Search for Common Ground. Let me start with the usual housekeeping. This event is being recorded and the video recording will be available afterwards on the website and will be sent to those who registered. There is a Q&A and we will be moving to have some conversation with everyone who is listening as we go along. So with that, with the formalities taken care of, I'd like to welcome Sharon Rosen from Jerusalem. She's sitting in Jerusalem right now, and situate this in the context of a new project that the Berkeley Center has launched that is following up on the notion of the culture of encounter, and particularly the common humanity document that was signed in the United Arab Emirates between Pope Francis and the Sheikh of Al-Azhar, where they essentially challenged us to look to this culture of encounter as a vehicle, as a way of looking at peace. Sharon Rosen is, I would say, a friend and a colleague and a very remarkable woman. She has been with Search for Common Ground, which she will talk about, since 2005. But since 2017, in other words, for 4 years, she has been looking at and focusing on Search's global religious engagement strategy. So she has this long history of working with Search for Common Ground, really working across cultures and religions in the Jerusalem office, and has worked on a wide variety of projects, which include the Universal Code of Conduct on Sacred Holy Sites. So she's an expert on designing and implementing interreligious programming and building on collaboration. So the issue of peace, I think, is very central. Sharon is originally from London, England, and she has a BA and master's from Hebrew University and has long experience as a facilitator in the world. So I'm going to invite Sharon to talk initially about the special role that she has as looking at the religious dimensions in a very non-religious organization. And then we can maybe move on to the question of what we mean by peace and what the culture of encounter might mean. But I think introducing your 4-year journey might be a good way to start.
Well, thank you very much, Catherine, and it's really a pleasure to be in conversation with you. It's always interesting and challenging, our conversations together, and I've always enjoyed them very much. And maybe I will begin by, in fact, contradicting you on the last thing that you said, in that I would not call Search a non-religious organization, because very interestingly, we have just recently done a survey at Search for Common Ground with all our staff, and we have about 1,000 people working at Search in different places around the world. And what was interesting was that over 90% of Search staff say that they identify with religion. Religion is important to them. So what is true, though, is that we are a non-faith-based organization, and it's actually interesting how we have developed, how I have become a director of religious engagement globally for Search, which is something quite new in its 40-year history. So why has Search gone in this direction? it's, of course, Search has always worked with religious actors. You can't work in conflict and peace building in places like Africa, the Middle East and Asia and not work with religious actors. But, and in fact, when I joined Search 17 years ago, I came in specially to work, my very first project was on trying to reduce tensions around what could, I think, most probably be called the most contentious holy site in the world, the Haram al-Sharif Temple Mount in Jerusalem. And I guess you can say I spectacularly failed on that, because if you look at the situation now as opposed to 17 years ago, I think we must probably deteriorated rather than the reverse. So we have worked on religious engagement or worked with religious actors in various parts of the world, but there have been individual projects which have more been related to topics like building social cohesion or reducing or transforming violent extremism, but not specifically a strategic approach to how to work with religious actors. And as you mentioned before, I've also worked for many years as Search's representative in a partnership with 3 other organizations on developing a universal code of conduct on holy sites, which we've implemented in various different places. So that has been going on through these years. So why was I appointed 4 years ago to take on this position? And I think it was a confluence of events. I think we were slightly quick off the mark, let us say, in recognizing the need to work more strategically with religious actors. At the same time, you could see that governments were beginning to recognize this as well. They started to appoint ambassadors of religious freedom in various places, and more resources were put into trying to find ways to engage religious actors in reducing conflict. And so I came on board in order to develop a strategic approach for Search, which aligned with our common ground values, and at the same time provided opportunities for us to work with religious actors in different places in I wouldn't say a uniform way, because one of the points I'm going to make very strongly is that context is absolutely everything where we work, and therefore you cannot do the same thing in different places, but at least some sort of strategic overview which really did align to our principles and values. I mean, there are other reasons, of course, why we decided that this was the right time to start working on these processes. Religion is not the main cause of conflict today in the world. In fact, it has never been the main cause of conflict. Well, not for a long time, maybe if you go back 500 years. But if you look at the 20th century, for example, the 2 world wars and the Russian Revolution, the changes to Stalin, the years of Stalin and other conflicts really had nothing to do with religion, or were not caused by religion. But, and hundreds of millions of people were killed in those. But I think we can say now that most conflicts now do have a religious dimension to them in one way or other. And it's important to work with religious actors in order to bring them in as part of the solution. And religion is generally actually a force of peace in the world, but it also, I mean, we have to admit that it is a weapon of war as well. And
So
therefore, yeah.
yeah, you've talked about the strategy and the strategic. So how I know you've spent a lot of time talking and thinking about what is strategic and I guess what is not strategic. What might be some of the elements that you're focusing on that you that represent, I think, your journey along this 4-year path?
Well, I think first of all, it was doing a lot of research and see how we have been working on it to try and draw out commonalities from the different places we have worked. And also we did a lot of research on many other organizations and institutions as well. But I think most of all, we really tried to align it to the principles and values of our Common Ground approach. And when I talk about that, Search has developed, or Search has taken on 5 foundational values that informs all the initiatives, all the work that we do around the world. And the first one is collaboration. And collaboration includes inclusion, as well, and working with diversity and bringing in women and youth and working cross-sectorally, because because we totally believe that if we are going to work towards peace, then we have to do it in a collaborative way by finding the commonalities and the common interests between peoples. So that really does inform our work everywhere. And that's not easy, actually, when you're working with religious actors in many cases, because traditionally religions have been patriarchal, where the authority has resided mostly with men. And therefore, how do you create that possibility of bringing in women and youth and other and all diversity, religious minorities to the table? So that's one aspect of it. And another one of our values is empathy. So giving empathy, listening very deeply, listening to all the sides, even if you don't agree with them, and trying to draw out what you can find in common between the different peoples. Another one is, well, we have audacity and tenacity, because we recognize that we really need to be creative and innovative in the way that we work, and adaptive. That's our audacity, to find new ways, and tenacious, because the changes that we're looking for take years. 10 years is not a long time for changes towards peace. And then the final one is that concrete desire for results, for showing that we have made a difference and sustaining that difference. So when I talk about strategy, I'm talking about how we develop ways of working with religious actors that take all these into account.
That's fascinating, and it echoes very much, I think, with the kinds of values that you would hear from Religions for Peace, for example. But have there been surprises or new insights that have come from this strategic reflection? You've been in a very unique position, sort of straddling these different worlds, one that I empathize with very much. But I am interested in how your own thinking might have changed, or what are the challenges? Let's come back in a minute to the issue of women and youth, but just in general.
I don't think I personally have changed that much. I would say that I very much align with the Search for Common Ground values. It's true that because we are not a faith-based organization. I actually don't talk about my own religion at all there. And I'm wondering, I presume people know that I am Jewish, which I am. It's something that I very rarely talk about unless I'm particularly asked, but I am, I'm an observant Jew, I'm a practicing Jew. I very much believe in those values of collaboration, of hope, which is what Audacity brings, of empathy, of the listening, of the appreciation and awareness of self and other. And I would say that for me, the message or the desire to seek peace and pursue it, if we can say that from the Psalm 34, has very much been a very strong direction of my life. And particularly so after having lived in South Africa under apartheid for 6 years, and in Ireland with the Troubles for 5 years, and then of course living in Jerusalem for 35 years with all the conflicts that's around me. I've become totally convinced that the only way that we are going to be able to find peace is actually doing something completely different from what most countries do, which is to fight and to create war. I think that there is an absolute need to find peace everywhere. And there are, and I have not been surprised in as much as I have found many religious actors in different places who want the same thing. And if you listen to them and hear what their fears and their concerns are and their traumas in many cases, you're able to get underneath that and find a way forward, not with everybody, but with my experience with working on projects is that that has been the case. I guess what has perhaps surprised me more than anything else is that maybe just that you can make that difference, that when you do come in and really listen to people, that shift can happen and you can move forward. But the building of the trust takes a long time. I didn't think that it would take as long as it does. And my other experience has been that often traumas, particularly in conflict, are so deep that even when you have built trust, if something happens and there is violence, then people recede back to those places of pain and anger. And then it takes time to build up that trust again. I don't know if I answered your question, but that's what I'm seeing.
Yes, and you've answered in two ways, because you've addressed, which I really wasn't even daring to explore, which is your personal journey, but more how this fits within the context of a global organization that is so focused on this problem of peace. Let's turn to the Abu Dhabi Declaration, the common humanity, and the agreement on the need to work towards this culture of encounter. I'd be fascinated by your reflections on that. And what are the challenges that you see in this agreement between Pope Francis and the Sheikh of Al-Azhar, which has so few precedents, I think, in history?
Yes. First of all, I welcome it. I think it's very important that religious figures of that standing come together and make a declaration like that. And they have an enormous following, and I think that can already make a difference. I would have liked to have seen it to be more inclusive, not just Islam and Christianity. I think that there is place for other religions to come in, but perhaps there is a need to start with two and then move on from there. So I accept that. Sometimes I find the language a little bit, even though there is a place for women and there is an attempt to talk about women and include them as well, I think that maybe I would have used perhaps a slightly different language in relation to that. But generally, I think that the message, the overriding message is very positive and very important. Maybe one other thing I would say is that it's slightly pontificating, if you don't mind my using that term. But, you know, it's a kind of, this is the state of the world as it is now. I have a sense that the world is more complex than what is written there. And I suppose in a declaration like that, you have to cut where you need to condense it. But my sense was that it doesn't cover the real complexities of the world as we live in today.
Yeah, that's I think an astute comment, and one that does lend itself to asking, again, coming back to this notion of strategy, where do you start and what are the priorities? So maybe you could comment briefly on how your strategic reflections within Search translate into programs and action. What does it mean for what you do and for what you think the organization and others should do vis-a-vis this religious engagement?
Yeah. Well, first of all, over the 4 years, I developed, my department developed a toolkit which specifically looks at how one, looks at definitions, who are religious actors and how you work with them. And it is really focused on, I think, religious literacy, which seems to me to be very missing in many places. And we heard from our own staff that there was a lack of confidence about how to actually engage with religious actors. And so it was very important for us strategically to help to provide direction on how to, and also on what, also on religious sensitivity, because you can just in your language with religious actors, you can lose the possibility of working together with them if there are misunderstandings around language. And therefore, there has been a lot of efforts in doing that and applying the lessons that we've learned on the ground. And they are very different, actually. Our toolkit, which is now available in English, French, and Arabic, again, because there was a demand for other languages as well, is full of case studies about work that we have done in religious engagement, things that work and things that don't work. Sometimes it is not the right direction to work with religious actors in certain places. There are risks in doing that, or there are risks in working with certain religious actors. And therefore it's that this sensitivity around who you work with and how you work with them is so important that that's very much a part of the strategy. I can say that, yeah, you wanted to.
No, I just was wondering if you would be willing to give a couple of examples.
That's exactly what I was just going to do.
Good.
I want to give an example of the work we have done on Mount Zion, actually, which was originally focusing on the Universal Code of Conduct on Holy Sites that we developed, which was basically it was based on the idea that that in order to safely protect holy sites, you need to bring in the relevant authorities to be able to do that in collaboration, that you can't make decisions for others. But so it was like a North Star, let's say, for a project that we carried out on Mount Zion together with our partner, the Jerusalem Intercultural Center, that's based on Mount Zion and just outside the old city of Jerusalem. And what's fascinating about that Mount Zion is that there is one shared holy site there, which has the tomb of King David at the bottom, or Nabi Dawood for the Muslims. On the middle section, it's the room of the Last Supper, which of course is a very important site for Christians. And on top, there is a minaret. And there was always tremendous tensions around this holy site. And there are various institutions on the Mount, religious institutions, and there was quite a lot of violence going on there. And we went in and we worked in various different ways to try and reduce that tension. And the different ways were as follows. We actually created a committee, let's say, or a group of people who were representatives of the different institutions. And we brought them together to get to know each other, but mainly to deal with very practical, prosaic issues like how do you clear the rubbish off Mount Zion from 2 million visitors who come every year? How do you fix the broken paving? How do you deal with security on the Mount? And we brought in representatives from ministries and from the different religions, ministries actually as observers, but the police also came in to explain. And by the third meeting, the different institutions, representatives of the different religious institutions were already talking about a common vision for Mount Zion. They had never spoken to each other properly before. So just the opportunity of coming together around common interests enabled this to happen. Secondly, we provided trainings, on-site visits for over 1,000 students and pre-army students and school students who came to understand and see and learn about the different religions on their tour there. And we also trained all the police of the old city in religious sensitivity. We also called for volunteers to just be on the Mount in order to help the tourists to provide a stable presence. And they, we thought we'd get about 20, we got over 150 volunteers who came to do that. And it's these things together that actually reduce the violence in a very practical way, and it has been maintained like that as a result.
It sounds like very practical, down-to-earth approaches and issues. Would you say that is a common theme, that you start with things that are very pragmatic, or do you find yourself dealing with some of the theological issues as well?
We very much do deal with theological issues. Another example I can bring is something that I've been working on every day here. So, but we have many other examples as well that I can talk about. But there's another one where we have, over the last 6 years, been working with Muslim and Jewish religious actors, men and women, from the national religious communities in Israel. So they are not the ones who are ready to divide the country up into two at all. And on the Muslim side, members of the Islamic movement, Southern Branch, and the process of working with them was to try and develop a religious language for political peace engagement, recognizing that we have not succeeded in over 100 years now to find a way to peace. And most of the people who have stopped that over the last years have been the minority religious voices on the different sides. And so we have been spending the last couple of years talking about the subjects at the heart of the conflict, but through a religious lens, through the texts that they bring. So subjects like the holiness of the human being, the holiness of the person, the holiness of the land, talking about Jerusalem and the importance of Jerusalem, talking about what peace means in the different texts, finding those common, the common language that they can speak of today, a relationship with the other in the different texts. And of course, there are differences. There are always going to be differences. We don't want to create one religion for everybody. We want to recognize and respect those differences, but we can also find the commonalities that make a difference. And as a result of that project, we now have a new curriculum, a 4-lesson curriculum, which is going into religious institutions on these subjects, given by both Muslim and Jewish leaders together, going into both Arab-speaking schools and or religious institutions and Hebrew ones. And we have developed a joint platform, a Facebook page, run by 2 of our religious leaders, a Muslim and a Jew, where we discuss issues of the day. Everything is in Hebrew and in Arabic.
So that's a Search for Common Ground initiative?
Sure.
Fascinating. I encourage people to post questions in the Q&A. We already have one, but before we turn to that, you've touched a couple of times on what has been a constant theme in discussing religious engagement, which is the roles of women and youth, given the traditional profiles of leadership, which tend to be male and not as young. So I'm interested in what you see as ways to break through that, the practical ways to bring in meaningful ways women and youth into the dialogue, into the projects and the discussions.
First of all, there is definitely a change that is happening. And you can see across the board, not just through our programs, but many other programs, that women are taking much more of a role. Youth may be a little less as an integrated part of the whole. There tend to be children and youth programs. And I would really like to see more youth involved in a larger, intergenerational projects, I would say. And again, we're also beginning to see that too in Religions for Peace. In their last 2 conferences, youth played a very important role, and it was very exciting to watch them take the reins, and women as well, by the way. So I think that there is definitely a change taking place anyway. It's more difficult in the more closed fundamental societies or in very traditional societies. One of the problems is that women themselves don't have the confidence to take part with the men, or they feel very tongue-tied. And we have learnt that there are different ways of including women. Sometimes we are able to bring women in from the beginning. I mean, I've had a situation where we're quite firm about people understanding that women have a role to play in our projects. But I had a Muslim leader saying to me, I would really like to bring women in, but we don't have any women and Muslim religious leaders to bring in. which is another reason why we don't actually call them religious leaders, but religious actors, because there are plenty of women who are playing the role of leadership within their community, but don't see themselves at all as leaders, as religious leaders anyway. So I think that it is changing. We sometimes run separate programs for women. We are very sensitive about how to bring them, when to hold the meetings so that they're able to attend. And I'm amazed actually at the excitement that we see from women after they have participated. Quite a few of the women who have worked with, have been in our projects, are now studying Sharia, which was never open to them before. So yeah, so it's a process, as I say, it's a process, it takes time, but it's changing. It's changing in the wider society, perhaps a bit faster, but it's also changing within religious societies as well.
Well, this is obviously a discussion that's taken place in many institutions. I worked in the World Bank, and when I started, women were invisible in leadership, and it's taken time. But I think one of the important findings is how often the agenda changes when you have significant numbers of women at the table. I mean, you have done a lot of work over the years with children, for example, and it is striking how seldom children's issues dominate in all male discussions. But when women are there, children seem to come up. I don't know if I'm overgeneralizing, but wondered if that echoes with you.
Yeah, I don't know actually. I'm just trying to think whether women talk about children more. I think they talk about themselves much more and the role of women. Maybe they take it for granted. What's really interesting also is that certainly here in the part of the world that I'm living, people are so proud of their children. A lot of them have many children, actually. And when they're asked to introduce themselves, they talk about themselves, and then they talk about how many children they have, and they talk about what their children are doing and what degrees their children have. So, and that's the men as well, not just the women. So I think that maybe it's taken more for granted in that respect.
Well, it's a danger of overgeneralization, but in trying to make the argument, there is the fundamental logic of including women on human rights, but also simply numbers grounds. But I think that to me, there is also a dimension of that issues have different priorities to different groups, inevitably. Well, we do have several questions, so let me turn to them and see if I can read it. Malith Kaur says, what are essential areas of cooperation in which policymakers around the world can work with religious actors to promote peace? So the essential areas of cooperation is the question.
Well, one subject which is coming up over and over again is the whole question of religious freedom in all its aspects. And policymakers are working with them greatly with religious actors in order to do that, which is sometimes a little ironic, because sometimes you would think that the majority religion would be less open to religious freedom of others, but that's actually the reason why you have to work with them, because they are the ones who are going to make the change. And so we are actually working now in many countries on religious freedom, on advocating for it, working specifically with religious actors. We have a wonderful project which we started recently as part of a consortium, a 5-year project called JISRA, and I never remember what it actually stands for, but it's, I wrote it down, but I haven't got access to it at the moment. And it is a Dutch-funded project which is focusing on lobbying and advocacy for religious freedom, for freedom of religion or belief in 7 countries around the world. And that is focusing on 3 different pathways. One of them is an intra-religious, so working with people within their own religion, looking at texts to see what their texts say about this, then going into the inter-religious pathway where we bring the different religions together. And then there's the extra international pathway of advocacy across the board for religious freedom. And within that, there is a very strong focus on the voice of women, the voice of youth, building that up, giving them the confidence, giving them the opportunities to speak and act, and also, of course, on religious minorities. So that's just one example of how policymakers are trying to make a difference in the different countries.
Yeah, well, that is clearly an important area where there's organizations as well as a lot of intellectual debate going on. Olivia Jarrell is asking something that maybe takes off from there. What have been some effective methods of facilitating and mediating interreligious dialogue, and what have been aspects of your facilitation strategy that have failed? How do you consider your positionality in these conversations? I guess that's both individually and as an organization.
Yes. I would say that in this respect, there is a benefit to being a non-faith-based organization that Search for Common Ground is, because we tend to be seen more as impartial in the roles that we play as we convene people together. And here, I think it's really important, though, that the facilitators are faith literate, even if they are not faith-based as such. And the facilitation method, because we focus so much on process, on the building of trust and of recognizing the dignity of everybody. And we also teach the common ground approach to people. That's the way forward. We don't actually give the content. We ask the people to provide the content, and we call on them. If we're doing text study or whatever, we call on them to do that. But what we are there for are as impartial facilitators to enable the conversation to move forward, and also to make very clear decisions about where we think the group is at and how and what they need in order to take that next step. And yes, we've made mistakes by deciding perhaps that things have been understood where they have not been, or whether maybe the trust has not been as strong as we would like it to be. But what we have found is that communication and more communication and more communication, we have many WhatsApp groups that go all the time, actually overcomes that. And even if we do make mistakes, then, and there is this regression, there is a resilience also as a result of what has come before.
No, it's striking.
One other thing I just want to say is that focusing on something practical, which is which answers the needs of the different groups, even if it's a different interest altogether. I mean, we've had that as well. People have come to meetings because they have completely different interests, but it served their purpose to meet the other. And then we work from that.
No, I was just commenting how often this word trust is coming up in contemporary discussions. Everything to do with COVID, everything to do with governance, with polarization seems somehow to come back to this question of building trust. We have two questions. There's several questions they're pouring in now, but we have two from Jennifer Eggert, which are quite long, but let me see if I can give you both of them and see how you react. So there's a perception that interfaith initiatives in the context of Israel-Palestine, but also beyond, tend to focus on religious commonalities and differences rather than on the actual roots of the conflict, including the occupation, actual issues, but also making interfaith dialogue more attractive in the eyes of those keen on avoiding controversial issues. How do you deal with this fine line in your own work? Maybe I'll leave it at that. I think that probably is enough for one exchange.
We are not an interfaith. We are not in the business of interfaith. I'll say that, up front. For us, the interfaith discussions are a medium for reducing conflict and for a political conflict, not just conflict amongst communities. And therefore, and that is the purpose and mission of this project that we have had for the 6 years. And that's what the funder has given us the money for. And therefore, we don't avoid it. And we say up front that that is not our purpose here. Our purpose is to make a difference in the conflict itself. And we work with pretty influential people who can have strong influence and benefit, give benefit to change the attitudes of their communities as well. So yes, so we do not avoid it. We go straight on with it, but we do it with sensitivity and we do it through a religious lens. I think that I can't emphasize more.
Yeah. Because
it's through that we are able to bring people along with us.
Yeah. Well, Jennifer is jumping right into it. And she says that she's asking about your positionality. And you had said you don't often mention your personal religious background, but other identifiers such as race, ethnicity, gender, or education are harder to hide. What role do you feel these have played in your work? And how do you deal with this? I guess that gets to one of our contemporary issues, doesn't it? Of how we deal with our own engagement.
We deal with it with a lot of self-reflection. Actually, reflection is a very important part of our work at Search for Common Ground. We have a department where we learn and we evaluate, and we are continually self-reflecting on our projects and on ourselves. And it's, I mean, I'm very aware of being a woman in the role that I'm in right now. I'm also aware of the fact that much of my knowledge has been through osmosis, through my many experiences and through living with my life partner and so on. And so I think that is the way that you have to, that you need to look at it. It's true. We are the sum of who we are. But if we are aware of that, then we are more likely to be able to deal with it in relation to other people.
And we're all of us pretty complicated, I think. So we have many different sides. Here's a very practical question. Where can we find more information about the Islamic Jewish Project to find a common religious vocabulary for discussing? By the way, we will in the follow-up email and on the website include a variety of resources. This might be among them, as well as the video of the event. And we will be preparing sort of a distillation for the broader Culture of Encounter project. But maybe you guide Stephen Mailloux to that one.
Thank you. Where our work on religious engagement on Israel-Palestine is actually is kept quite confidential. We don't have that much information out on it, and quite frankly, a lot of that has to do with the fact that we have offices in many different countries in the Middle East, and we need to protect the people who are working there. At the same time, we do have case studies in our toolkit, which can be found on the religious engagement landing page of Search for Common Ground's website. And I think that there might be some information, although I think we did not add that much, some of it, on the online courses that we have developed with USIP, which have been we have a wonderful online course, Introduction to Religious Engagement in Peace Building, a Common Ground Approach, which was launched in July in English and has proved extremely popular. And we just launched it a couple of weeks ago also in Arabic and in French.
Great. Yeah, I think that's another resource that we can include. Now, Emily Reynolds has another challenging question. You said many religious actors want the same things. Are there 2 or 3 things you could name that, in your experience, nearly all religious actors want?
All religious actors.
Apart from peace and love.
Yes. Well, all religions call for peace and love, I must say. The question is whether we're actually able to reach them. Or maybe that's that they see it as a lifetime effort, so they've got a long way to go. But all religious actors want to protect, they want to have access to their holy sites and want to protect their holy sites. So that's why the Universal Code of Conduct on Holy Sites was such a wonderful common tool for all of them to get together on. All of them want to maintain and sustain their religion. I think all of them want to practice their religion in a way that freely, in a way that they choose to. Unfortunately, what happens though is that sometimes majority religions don't allow others to do that, and that's one enormous piece of work that we need to do, and which we are beginning to do with our religious freedom programs. We're also setting up inter-religious freedom roundtables in countries in Central Asia, in Sri Lanka, in Jordan, in Lebanon, where we are trying to promote this. But all of them want their children to live in peace. We just have to try and find ways to get them to understand that it's only through collaboration and caring for the other will that actually happen.
And I think that the broader understanding of peace, that really is about opportunities to enjoy the kinds of lives that are possible in the modern world, that are healthy, that have ideas, that have culture, and so forth. Now we have quite a few questions. Let me try 2 quick. Marco Ferrario has a challenging question to you, but I'll just read it and then go on to Metropolitan Seraphim. So religions historically have been the major reasons for clashes between countries and civilizations. What makes you think that the situation is reversed? So let's park that one for a second. This one is, in which ways faith community voices can cooperate with civic, I presume, NGOs with respect to international law, as any risk for peaceful coexistence of nations and people comes when there's a lack of the implementation of international law. And secondly, what structures are there after meetings like the General Interfaith Assemblies in Germany to restore justice and protect human rights of people? So do you want to take any angle of that. We're coming fairly close to the end, so
I
think-
do want to say a few words about human rights and the way that we work at Search for Common Ground. Of course, we totally believe in human rights for everybody. And sometimes religion is seen as not aligned with human rights or certain human rights. But and sometimes that is so. If we look at human rights in the legal terms of the Declaration of Human Rights, however, there are many ways, I think, of working with religious actors to reach that place of supporting those rights. But I don't think we are going to be that successful by doing it in an adversarial form.
Yeah.
I think it's only through working with religious actors that we are going to be able to move them forward to a place where they recognize the rights of all. So that's one point I wanted to make. Another point is that, yes, we do work on issues of working with lawyers, working with courts. We've done that in Kyrgyzstan, where we've actually worked together with the government and with policymakers, and representatives of religions have come together to actually change the constitution on religious minorities. And then we have gone in and trained and worked with the lawyers so that the constitution is carried out correctly within the law courts. And we know that we hope to be able to do that in other countries as well, where there is a very big problem of the mob, for example, taking control and not allowing the courts or making people, judges and the lawyers frightened to actually stand up for the rights of people.
Yeah. Well, we're coming very close to the end. So, and there are a number of other questions that we can put into the follow-up notes. And certainly I can assure everyone that we will reflect on them, both of us. But let me finish with one last question that will at least give you a chance to sort of reflect on Search. From Brian Farr, can you comment on the reach of Search for Common Ground and what is being done to extend the reach? So a little bit looking ahead as we come to a close.
I'm very excited at the impact and the expanding influence of our approach at Search for Common Ground. Just in basic financial terms, I was amazed at the budget that we have at the end of this year, which is so much larger than last year, simply because there is a recognition that we are doing good work in many different places around the world. Our desire is to expand our influence and impact on norms in societies, on markets in societies, on people. And we have the ambition to do so. We have many people who believe in what we're doing. And I think that we're going to go from strength to strength.
Great. No, it's an exciting organization, and it is, I think, very telling and very inspiring that Search has really taken on this role of looking more systematically and strategically at the religious factors, complicated as they are, and that they've appointed you who bring, I think, some very special talents, perspectives, and questions, and a willingness to look these problems in the face. So with that, I'd like to thank you so much for this conversation. Thank you also to all who have tuned in and who will be listening to the recording later. I think that this is a clear case where we've opened up not a Pandora's box, but certainly a very large box of questions and challenges to us all. And I wish you all a wonderful holiday. I hope you're going to get some kind of a break, and let's, I don't know whether we cross our fingers or pound the floor or pray that the COVID pandemic will come under control, and that we will be able to take this Kairos moment to look positively, constructively, and creatively at rebuilding afterwards. So thank you so much.